Vincenzo, thank you so much for taking the time with me to talk a little bit about your career. I'm going to start by asking you about your family because you grew up in a house with artists. Your parents were both artists, one a photographer, the other one a painter. And I was wondering if that influenced your future career as a filmmaker, and if so, how?
Yeah, I was lucky. I had parents that supported my crazy dream to make movies, and they were divorced from practically the moment I was born. But they were both very interesting people, and there was and very creative and artistic. And I've seen people with tremendous talent who were held back because their parents didn't believe in their dream. And so I know how profoundly valuable that is. And so much of what we do is just based on our belief that we can do it. And especially so with movies, because movies are like architecture. They're incredibly expensive things that we have to erect that involve a lot of people, a lot of money and time. And so you have to have this kind of invisible shield of belief to get through that process and see it to the end. And I think if you don't have that foundational kind of support like I did, it's really, really tough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Agree, absolutely. So now let's talk to you about your films. So Cube, your first movie, it became kind of a modern cult classic in many circles. And it started the trend of you talking about people that are trapped and going in circles.
Right.
In your films. And I was wondering, how did that theme come about?
Well, I'm sure being trapped and going in circles is a little bit autobiographical. I'm sure we all feel that to a greater or lesser extent, but not to be psychoanalytical about it or anything. But I was aware that when I came up with the idea of Cube, when I initially wrote it with my lifelong friend, Andre Bajelic, we were roommates in our 20s, living in a small house and kind of miserable as, that point in your life where you have such high ambitions and nothing's happening. And so I think there was a sense of entrapment that we were feeling. And I was aware of that. And I was also aware that the movie, it wasn't a movie at that point, but the script at that time was allegorical, that the truth is we all are born into this world without a map. And we have to negotiate our way through it. And there are traps along the way. And there are people who may help us or may hurt us. And we have to choose wisely who we align ourselves with. And, it is a kind of maze. So, yeah, I think I realized that it was talking about life in this very basic, primal way. And I always think the best science fiction or horror or fantasy is metaphorical. I really believe in the metaphor that these genres in particular are like our contemporary mythology, that they present stories that on their surface are just fantastical and entertaining. But when they resonate with us, it's because there's a deeper truth hidden beneath that surface. And I confess that I kind of knew Cube had that at least always there.
That is fascinating. All right. On with your second film, the criminally underrated Cypher. Yeah, it's very good. So yeah, it's a fighter that both kind of plays around with the tropes and satirizes it as well. It's so weird. It's very funny. People don't get that it's supposed to be funny.
Yeah.
So yeah, how did you approach walking the line between a mind twister and satire?
Well, first of all, Cypher was written by a friend of mine, Brian King, and it really is his creation. And so I, at that time, was having made Cube, desperately trying to make this other project I had called Splice. But no one wanted to do Splice. And, the problem was somebody did want to do Splice. There was a Canadian producer who had the resources to do it. And I spent a year developing it with him, beyond developing it. Like we did visual effects tests. I storyboarded the whole thing with very intense prep, in addition to rewriting the script. And at the end of that year, he elected not to make the film, which was his prerogative. But it kind of left me in a bad spot because years had passed since I made Cube. And I was like, I can't make a movie. And it's that sophomore feature thing, the terror that you had. Your first film was the success of some kind. And now what do you follow it up with? And my follow-up tanked. It wasn't happening. But concurrent to this, my friend Brian King was giving me this script, which was called Company Man, to read. And I was just giving him notes on it. And eventually he sent me a draft, and I went, this is like really, really good. I would like to make this movie. Too bad I won't, because Ridley Scott's going to direct it, or some big director. I thought he was going to send it out and it would, it would capture like some world-class filmmaker. Somehow it didn't, or somehow I maintained my grip on it. And I got to make it, but it was Brian's creation. It really was. And so I just sort of slipped into it, but I slipped into it like a hand in a glove because it was so comfortable for me. And I felt so lucky to have come across this thing. And it did all those things that you're talking about. Like, I like spy movies. But it's sort of James Bond meets Kafka. Like, there's this underlying social satire that's Brian is playing out. And I really connected with that too. It was a mixture of those two things. And then that happened super fast. That suddenly was financed and all the pieces came together almost too quickly, actually. And it was a great experience shooting it. And I'm very proud of that movie. You should be. It's very, it had the misfortune of being bought by Miramax. And I gotta say, that was while we were shooting, and I told the producers, arrogantly, I said, do not sell this film, because when it's finished, it's gonna be so great. We'll be able to sell it for a lot more. But they sold it to Miramax. And then I think what happened was Miramax released 2 Philip K. Dick-esque movies. One of them was a Philip K. Dick adaptation, Imposter. And then the other one was Equilibrium. They're these kind of cool science fiction films that tanked at the box office. And I think mine was the third one in line. And they're like, yeah. So it's so sad. They just stuck it in a closet, basically.
That sucks. Yeah. People should see it more.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you for saying that.
Great. And then, sorry, because my questions are there. Mm-hmm. And then you released in 2003 Nothing, that you made with your lifelong collaborator and friend David Hewlett.
Yes.
And I was wondering, how did that friendship come about? And also, why isn't he in the tall grass, since he's in everything?
Oh, I know. That's maybe certainly the only feature I've made without David Hewlett in it. But Nothing, much like Cube, sort of came out of this desire to make a film with very limited resources. And it's sort of Cube's comedic twin. And it was written with David and with Andrew Miller, who's also an actor in Cube and just become quite a successful writer since then. And David, I first knew from high school because he was like the actor in high school. He was clearly very talented, and he, as a teenager, began to get professional work. And so I meekly came up to him one day and said, "Do you want to be in one of my movies?" Because I'm a terrible actor. And he said yes. And so I think from the age of 15 onward, I've been making films with David, who is an actor and so much more, and such a brilliant guy, and dear, one of my closest friends, obviously, and very funny. Both Andrew and David are really funny. So I really wanted to do a comedy, and that's where that came from. You know, it's and there's a third part, if I can ever figure it out. But this sort of trilogy of minimalist films that I would like to do, which would just be with David, no one else, if I can crack it.
Well, can you talk about that?
I think it's better not to talk about it, because I don't know if I can figure it out. But that's something I'd like to do to kind of complete the trilogy.
Very cool.
Yeah.
And then after this documentary with Terry Gilliam, you finally made Splice.
Yes.
This insane, deranged,
yes,
very twisted film.
Yes. Thank you.
And can you talk about how you came up with that idea? And also, what was it like to pitch it to producers?
Well, So Splice was born from a mouse. There's this actual MIT experiment called the Canty mouse, which was a really shocking thing to see because it effectively looked like a mouse with a human ear growing out of its back. So it was like a Salvador Dali painting, but it was a living creature. And it was a hairless mouse. So it just looked very vulnerable. And it was the combination of all these things that struck a chord in me. And I thought, there's a movie in the mouse, even though the mouse never made it to my movie. But that sort of combination of, what the future of genetic engineering pretends to combine with some kind of very personal human drama, I thought would be really, really interesting. And so with Antoinette Terry, my co-writer, and later Doug Taylor, also co-writer, fashioned this story. And it was a kind of Frankenstein story, except our creature doesn't escape. In virtually all Frankenstein stories or derivatives thereof, the creature eventually gets out and causes chaos. In this one, I wanted the dark Frankenstein characters, our scientists, to become more monstrous than the thing that they'd made. And then really delve into what that relationship is, the relationship between the creator and the creatures, creators and the creature. And it eventually becomes sexual. And that's where I feel like the movie takes Mary Shelley's paradigm into the 21st century. But that, of course, was the very thing that made producers afraid of it, the thing that drew me to it. And it took a while. There were some people who were intrigued by it, but they would always step away, like the one producer I was talking about. And when that happened, I thought, well, this movie's never going to get made. So I spent a year developing this thing, and a lot of money was spent, like $500,000 was spent preparing the movie. So when the movie didn't happen, I had this kind of scary, politically, not politically, but this script that had sexual content that was scary and maybe dangerous from a commercial point of view, and $500,000 against it. So I was going to have to find someone to pay that money plus buy the script. It just seemed impossible. So it just sat on the shelf for a number of years. And so it's a very long story, but eventually planets aligned, and Guillermo del Toro I met at a film festival and had expressed interest in working with me. And I gave him the script and he liked it, along with Don Murphy, who's an American producer, and his partner, Susan Lundquist. And then I also got a call from a press producer I knew who was working with Gaumont, which is the world's oldest film studio in France. And they were looking for material. And then I think also this might have contributed to it. I did a segment of this movie called Paris Je t'aime, which was, and I did a little vampire story, which was a kind of romantic vampire story. And that went to Cannes. I think those things all combined to kind of reignite interest in Splice. And then, kind of like the creature, it resurrected itself. It just sort of came into being. And that was a pattern that continued throughout the whole making of it. It was one of these films that was incredibly difficult to make. And it would always reach a point where it just felt like the whole thing was going to collapse and fall apart. And then it would come back to life in the best possible way. And that happened in the prep. It happened in the financing. It happened in the shooting. And then it even happened when the film was finished. There was a global financial collapse happened, and no one was buying movies. And it was just sitting on a shelf. And I was like, this is going to go directly to DVD. But then somehow got into Sundance. And then of all people, Joel Silver saw it at Warner Brothers, very famous producer, did the Matrix movies. And he wanted it for his label there, Dark Castle. He had never bought a film from anyone before. So this was the first and possibly was the last one. And so it was released by Warner Brothers. It was crazy on 2020. So, and then it didn't do well. It failed at the box office, but then it's continued to have this life. And as early as like a month or so ago, it was like one of the top 10 films on Max, like the Warner Brothers streaming platform. So it's like, it just sort of continually resurrects itself. And yeah, that one was very near and dear.
So after a few dormant years where it didn't do much, you came out with Haunter.
Right.
Right. Which is a very cool twist on the haunted house film. And so, yeah, and this is the second one you wrote with Brian King.
This is the second movie that Brian King saved me with because he wrote it. So
Right.
the same thing.
Yeah,
Brian
right.
would just give it the script, and I was like, oh, he'll comment on it. He would do things. And then one day I was like, I really like the script. I want to make it. Can I make it? And he generously said yes. And then just like his other script, it came together like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that happened, a very similar scenario, kind of repeating, is talking about like going in circles and being trapped, story of my life. That was happening again, as it had with Splice, which segued into Cypher. At that time, I was trying to make two very ambitious science fiction films. One was High Rise. Jeremy Thomas is a producer, based on the J.G. Ballard novel. The other one was Neuromancer, based on the William Gibson novel.
Yeah.
And they were difficult. I knew going into they'd be difficult movies to get made. And they were excruciatingly difficult to get financed. So while that was going on, Haunter fell into my lap. I was like, I'm going to make this. And it was a wonderful experience. And I think it's just, Brian writes these fascinating puzzle-like scripts, that are so carefully, finely constructed, and, these sort of Chinese puzzle box stories. And Haunter, and yet with like a very profound emotional core. And Haunter is a story about this girl who is reliving her birthday every day. And she's 16 years old, her 16th birthday, and everyone in her family sees it as a new day, but she knows it isn't, and she can't understand what's going on. And then eventually comes to the realization that she's dead. And later on discovers that what she thought was a ghost haunting her house is actually a living girl. And she is the ghost. And the kind of connection that they form is really lovely. So that was good.
And most recently, you adapted Stephen King's short story In the Tall Grass. And with that one, you had kind of a challenge to use your mise en scène, your staging, to make grass scary. Right. How much of a challenge was that? How did you adapt? What was your creative process?
Making grass scary, tall grass scary, is not hard at all, because tall grass is like the ocean. It's like Jaws. You go into it and you can't see 2 feet in front of you, and there's something in your genetic memory that tells you that you're in danger. It's like, I'm sure that earlier in our evolution, going to tall grass is a really bad idea, because you very easily become prey to a larger predator. And so I didn't find it hard at all. And one of the things that really drew me to the novella and the possibility of it as a movie was just how beautiful that would be. That it was this very bright pastoral world with it, which Stephen King and Joe Hill, who wrote the novella together, father and son, had placed one of the most disturbing stories I've ever read. And so it was the juxtaposition of like something that's really, I love horror when they're married to something that's poetic and beautiful. And that story does it. And so again, I had a wonderful experience making that film too. And probably more resources than I've ever had for Angle.
Because it was with Netflix, that one. Right?
Yeah. I mean, it was with their low budget division, but their low budget division was like high budget as far as I was concerned. And I had a wonderful cast, and yeah, it was a really great experience. And it was an interesting experience shooting in grass, because there's only one movie that I'm aware of that has done that before. It's shot exclusively in tall grass, and that's Onibaba, which is this great Japanese movie. I adore it. And although I've never asked Stephen King or Joe Hill, I suspect maybe they knew of it when they wrote their story. I don't know. But that was a movie that was made in the 60s. There was no one to talk to about how they shot in tall grass. And tall grass is like snow. Once you put a film crew in it, is destroyed very quickly. So you have to figure out a way to fit a film crew into that environment without destroying your set, destroying your environment. And so there was it was a surprisingly complex the interesting process, figure out how to make that movie. So it was a great experience. It was really love. I think after I made that, before I made that film, I had done a lot of TV work. And when you make movies, it's kind of like going to the gym. Like you need to do it a lot. The more you do it, the more you shoot, the stronger you get. And I must say, I was feeling really buff as a filmmaker by the time I got to make that movie, because in between doing Haunter and doing In the Tall Grass, I'd had, I don't know, like 5 to 7 years of working on putting more time on set doing TV than many more times on set, not doing TV than I ever did in all of my movies, features combined. So it was it was great experience.
And now you've kind of taken a step back from filmmaking. You're doing other things. You've released an album, and also you are publishing your first graphic novel that you wrote and drew yourself. I got a copy of it, started reading it.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm really liking it. And so how do you approach these new mediums as opposed to filmmaking?
Yeah, well, in some ways, I'm a frustrated comic book artist. So because comic books were my first love as a kid, and I've always liked to draw. And when I make my films, I always storyboard them. So the storyboard is a little bit like a comic book of a movie. It's just the art is in this refined. But I had sort of held that desire in me for a long time. And then the confluence of having an idea for a movie that I knew would be very difficult to make because it would be too expensive and maybe weird for Hollywood. And the arrival of the iPad Pro tablet, which you could actually, was the first tablet you could draw on the screen, made me think, maybe I could do a comic book. Because using the tablet is much, much faster than doing it pen and paper. And I could do everything. I could do the lettering, I could do all the layout, I could do all the painting. Effectively, you could publish it out of the iPad. Like it was just this sort of one-stop tool for everything. And so about 5 years before it was published, I started that process. And in between TV or film gigs, I would work on it. And then the pandemic hit. And all of a sudden I had a lot of time on my hands. And so that's how I got to finish it. And I really loved it because unlike film, you don't need permission to do something like that. I would just sit down beginning of the day and I would do one page. That's what I averaged, was a page a day. And when the page was done, it was done. And I didn't get notes. I didn't have to finance it or anything. It was just finished. And it was really healthy. And I learned recently the value of just making things. I think the danger this is for the filmmakers out there, people who are thinking of getting into film. The danger with film is what Dorothy Parker famously said about Hollywood. It kills you with encouragement. There's always a carrot dangling that you're chasing, but you're never actually making anything, or rarely are you making something. And that's just how it is. It's been that way since the beginning. It will always be that way. So you have to find things that you can do as a creative person that are gratifying, where you just make stuff and you don't have to go through that whole process you do with a movie. And so that was what the graphic novel was for me. I really invigorated. It was really good thing to do.
Very cool. Again, I just started. I'm not done yet, but I'm really enjoying what I'm reading so far and what I'm seeing with the drawings.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. Well, thank you.
And I guess I'm going to have one last question since we have time. So you're here to present a 4K remaster of Cube. So how does it feel after all these years to see it again and rejuvenate it?
It's lovely. I mean, so I supervised the restoration with Derek Rogers, who's the cinematographer. And I hadn't seen the film in a long time. So it's kind of, a lot of mixed emotions. But at the end of the day, when you make a movie, it really is like having a child. And you love it as much for all of its flaws as for all of the things that do work. And I was so lucky that my first film was a movie that I really wanted to make. It wasn't like a step towards something else. It was the thing. And as hard as that film was to make, and it was very difficult, I made it with good friends. And so when I see David Hewlett and Andrew Miller on the screen in their younger incarnations, it's a wonderful feeling. It makes me very nostalgic, and it makes me appreciate how good they are and how great everyone is who was involved with the film. Derek went on to have a great career as a cinematographer. Jasna Stefanovic, who did production design, ended up working with Terry Gilliam and Sofia Coppola. Mark Corvin, who did the score, did Robert Eggers' movies, The Witch and Lighthouse, and many, many other things. And the list goes on and on. So it was the beginning of something for not just me, but a whole bunch of us. So there's something very meaningful to me buried in that film. And then have the opportunity to go back in and, just bring it into the 21st century, technologically. It's a 4K master, a digital grade. When we did it, there were no digital grades. It was a chemical grade. And so I was able to sweeten the image, but was very respectful to the original version because I don't like it when directors alter their films. It was just about enhancing what the film was visually, and then also orally. Like we did a mix on it as well, so made it into an Atmos mix, and I erased a coffee cup that I saw on the set. So there are a few little fixes like that, but it was really great to come back to it, and it reminded me how much I never want to shoot in the cube again. It's not fun shooting in a cube.
Thank you so much, Vincenzo. It was a great interview. Great to talk to you. I really hope that people show up at the screening for Cube. I mean, it is sold out, so they will show up.
Sure.
And thank you again so much for doing this.
I love it. Thank you so much. Thanks for going through the whole damn filmography. That wasn't too boring.